Welcome to The Truth. I'm John Gordon. This week, we have got a great interview with a former member of the Nixon and Reagan White House. And he has just authored a new book, and it is a look behind the curtain into the White House of those two administrations. You're going to want to hear his interview today. Then we have Marley Hornik up. She is an elections integrity expert. She's been working for the last 4 years. They have 9 lawsuits going around the country trying to impose free and fair elections as our Constitution demands. Then hope you'll stay tuned for our Growing Old Gracefully BS segment. We're going to continue our segment. This is segment 3 of Anatomy of a Facelift. I think you will be entertained and will enjoy what you will see. So, folks, just when we think things can't get any worse, they seem to get worse. The America First Tea Party has issued a statement saying that the Secretary of State's office in Georgia has instructed local boards of elections not to honor rules passed by the state election board. I mean, he may as well tell the state patrol or judges not to honor tickets issued by the state patrol. I mean, this is just crazy. Josh McCune, the Georgia GOP chair, has reached out to the RNC and their legal team to see what can be done about stopping Brad Raffensperger for what is clearly a miscarriage of his office. And Sally Grubbs, the chairwoman of the Cobb County Commission, has written a letter to the state election board encouraging them to show courage and do their jobs. Ms. Grubbs writes, the Secretary of State apparently is taking action in defiance of your promulgated rules. Why are actions being taken by the Secretary of State contrary to the rules? Who has advised the Secretary to take such an adversarial role? The Georgia Code annotated states that the Secretary of State shall, upon request of the state election board, provide any and all necessary support and assistance to the state election board in its sole discretion, determines it is necessary to enforce this chapter and to carry out or conduct any of its duties that would be conducting elections. And they're saying that the state attorney or state Secretary of State is obligated to follow the dictates of the election board. But here you have a constitutional officer who is undermining a legally constituted board that is entrusted with delivering honest, free, fair elections. So you know that I have been very critical of Brad Raffensperger. I don't trust him. I think he's a fake. I think he's a fraud. I don't know what his motives are or what he's up to. All I know is that I also think that he does not tell the truth. I derive no pleasure from saying that. But I was in Judge Brian Amero's court when Brad Raffensperger appeared there through a assistant attorney general, acting on behalf of the Secretary of State. He fought tooth and nail the unsealing of the records and of the ballots in the 2020 election. Brad Raffensperger fought unsealing the absentee ballots. Now, why would somebody do that? What possible reason could they have to fight the unsealing of the records? I was in the courtroom when the Assistant Attorney General argued on behalf of the Secretary of State. The judge ruled in favor of the petitioners. He ordered that the absentee ballots be unsealed. That afternoon, Brad Raffensperger issued a press release commending the judge on his courage and his commitment to openness and transparency in government. Folks, I rest my case. What more do you need to know? This guy is bad, and he would lead you to believe that he won without a runoff against Jody Heiss, David Belle Isle, and Sheriff TJ. If you believe that, I've got some land here west of town in West Palm Beach I'd like to talk to you about. But these constitutional officers in Georgia are extremely worrisome to me. And someone from the Trump organization texted me earlier this week and said, are we going to win Georgia? And I said, yes, unless there's cheating. And it would seem like there is cheating coming from those in official capacities in the state of Georgia. And the state elections board, to their credit, have issued guideline rules, regulations for local boards of elections to follow. And the Secretary of State is saying, nah, flick them off. It's going to be litigated. Don't worry about it. Don't enforce them. He cannot do that. That is a breach of his oath of office and an abuse of his authority. And I just hope against hope that the local boards of elections will push back on him and will not allow another election to be stolen in Georgia, like I firmly believe, based on facts that I have personally seen, that the 2020 election was not an honest, free, and fair election in Georgia. All right, so we continue with our focus on lies, lies, lies. You watched the vice presidential debate held last week. Tim Walz made 30 trips to China, has made 30 trips to China. After having been accused of that, they said, no, actually it was only 15. Who cares? Have you been to China? I've never been to China. I don't believe I even know anybody from China. I think I do know one very nice lady in Georgia from China. Aside from that, I can't think of anyone that I know. The people that allowed Tim Walz to come to China, according to Gordon Chang, who is probably the leading authority in the United States today on the Communist China Party and their aggression, said that that entity that would have allowed Tim Walz to come in is the entity that is directly responsible for China's aggression against the Western world. In other words, he could not have done it he could not have come without their blessings. And then he wants to deny that he was there 30 times. Okay, 15. That's 15 more than I've been. 15 more than most anybody I know has been. So what is he up to? Oh, and then he told us that he fought in Iraq. That turned out to be a bald-faced lie. It is called stealing valor, and it is a felony. And this is the person that wants to be vice president of the United States. Then he told us that he was in Tiananmen Square when that famous, iconic picture was taken of the college student standing in front of the tank in utter defiance of China's oppressive governance. He was there. He told us. He was in Tiananmen Square. Well, thanks to some hardworking journalists and some fact-checking, he was not there. And in the debate, he excused it just on the basis that, oh, he was just a knucklehead. I don't even know what that means. What does that mean? He's a knucklehead. I'll tell you what I think he is. I think he is an absolute fraud and a liar. And my liberal friends are going to hand him the keys to the palace. Kamala Harris has said that she was in the room for every major decision that Joe Biden made while president of the United States and had the last word of all the advisors, and that she was proud of the work that she and the Biden administration have done. So to my liberal friends, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? Do you believe that they handled it correctly when we withdrew from Afghanistan? Did you approve of abandoning $80 billion in the most sophisticated armaments known to man that we were told had been disabled, that they abandoned and left in Afghanistan? And then we see the Taliban flying our helicopters over the capital city with corpses tied around, ropes tied around their heads, tied to a U.S. Black Hawk helicopter. It's true. $80 billion of the finest weaponry known to man we just abandoned, just left there. And it's now in the hands of the Taliban and probably the Chinese. We abandoned Bagram Air Force Base. To my liberal friends, are you proud of that? Do you agree with that decision to give up the most strategic Air Force base we have in the entire world, proximate to the border of China, Russia, and Afghanistan? Do you think that's good governance? And how do you feel about Bidenomics? Do you like 9% inflation? Do you like high interest rates that we've had to endure now for the better part of a year? For over a year, to tame inflation, to get it under control? Did you like 4.3% unemployment? That's what Biden has given you. Do you like $3.80 per gallon gasoline? It's over $4 in some parts of California. Do you like the crime that we're seeing? Do you have any remorse, regret, or any tinge of guilt for supporting an administration that allowed savage criminals to enter our country, who then murdered in cold blood the University of the student in Athens, Georgia? I'm sorry, she wasn't a student, she was a nurse, Laken Riley. So are you proud of that? Is that the kind of governance that you want? So are you proud of the fact that we're now involved in two wars, one in the Ukraine on the border of Russia, where Zelensky is firing American-made munitions into the heartland of Russia, the most provocational act I can think of, and then of all-out war in the Middle East between Israel and Iran-sponsored Hamas, that little group that beheads children and kills pregnant women and murders 200 concert goers in cold blood and kidnaps American citizens and kills them because we wouldn't pay the ransom. I mean, is that what you want to align yourself with? These are not Democrats. These are unhinged liberal communists. And I don't think that they're governing for us. I don't know who they're governing for. I think Biden is governing for Biden. The Biden crime family with 20 LLCs that have taken in $30 to $60 million of money from our adversaries. Is that who you really want to support? And the best that they can do is say, oh, well, Trump has all those indictments, those 29 indictments. I had a guy tell me that this morning. Yes, 29 false, fake, made up, fictitious indictments and crimes that have run the statute of limitations, that President Trump says that he didn't even know the woman, never met her, never seen her before, that accused him of committing a crime against her over 30 years ago. She hadn't bothered to mention it. She alleged that Trump raped her in a dressing room in Bergdorf Goodman. It is laughable. It is so absurd. It's such an absurd story. As I've shared with our listeners before, I've been to Bergdorf Goodman many times. I've lost count. I'm sure it's 30 or 40 times that I've been in that store on all the levels. I can tell you that it's utterly impossible that someone could be sexually assaulted in one of those dressing rooms and not to have been, for anyone else to have heard the ruckus. And I'm sure she would have cried out for help, wouldn't she? Wouldn't you? If you were being sexually assaulted in a semi-public space? I mean, those dressing rooms, you wouldn't have any expectation of privacy in them. And especially back 30 years ago, there weren't doors, there were curtains on those dressing rooms. I know because I used them. I used to go there and reward myself with a suit every year when I was starting my career and trying to present a professional image. That's where I like to shop. So I was intimately familiar with that store, and to say that someone was raped there in a dressing room, it disproves the allegation on its face. It is absolutely absurd. But that's what the Democrats, that's what Biden and Harris and Walz want you to believe, that Trump has committed all of these illegal acts. And they've lost virtually every one of those lawsuits. One by one, they have fell apart, including Jack Smith's lawsuit about the documents. And the United States District Court ruled that Jack Smith was illegitimate because he was not properly appointed as a special counsel. Merrick Garland just said, I bequeath you special counsel. Well, he's not. He doesn't have the power to do that. There is a process in this country for confirming a special counsel. It was not followed. The the district court judge, Judge Cannon, an hour north of where I'm sitting, had the courage and the guts to follow the law and call him out on it. So what does Jack Smith do? He goes and he comes up with a new indictment relating to the fictitious theatrical January the 6th. General Milley, who does not like Trump, wrote proximate to January the 6th that Trump had asked for 10,000 military troops to help secure the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on January the 6th. It totally vindicates President Trump and is consistent with his story. And it was found in Freedom of Information Act disclosures that were released just in the last couple of weeks. But the mainstream media doesn't tell you that because they hate Trump. You know what? I don't really even think that a lot of people in the mainstream media hate Trump. I think they're paid off. I think they're bought. And you've heard me say it. I'll say it again. We found out in the Twitter files, Michael Taibbi found that the FBI paid Twitter $3.4 million to censor and cancel people on Twitter if they published things that went against the government narrative about COVID and the vaccine. An heir to the Cox family said that the Cox Enterprises has contracts with the Department of Defense. A media and car company has contracts with the Department of Defense. Somebody should do a FOIA and get those invoices. Let's do it. So Walz has been to China, by his account, 15 times. Gordon Chang says the only way he could get in is to have a direct invitation from the Department of the Chinese government that is antagonistic, would be a threat to the United States and the Western world. And then, 4 years ago, you remember Biden told you, if you don't vote for Biden, you ain't black. Well, Obama just stole that playbook this week. He told black men that if they didn't vote for Kamala Harris, they were just sexist. When are we going to stop falling for the manipulation? Don't you see it? It is as clear as the nose on our faces that it is just a manipulation. They keep hitting the same button over and over again to manipulate people, to make them feel bad, to make them not want to be sexist, not to be racist, not to be misogynist, not to be whatever else is. I have developed the attitude that I don't care what you call me. I'm truthist. That's what I am. I am a truthist. Let's invent a new word. Let truth reign. Forget the labels. Forget the name calling. And if you're a black male or a black female, do you want to vote for someone that wants to keep you subject to the government, that wants to keep you dependent on the government? When Donald Trump was president of the United States, we had more African-American employment in the United States than ever before. We had the lowest unemployment rate in modern times. Not since the 60s have we seen full employment like we had under Trump. 3.2% is effective full employment. We had employment of blacks, Hispanics, Asians, women, the highest it has ever been. Don't you want that back? Don't you want that back? We had a fascinating conversation with Ken Khachigian, who is going to come on in just a minute and explain supply-side economics. Reagan wanted to expand the economy by reducing taxes, by giving citizens more money to spend, by building consumer confidence, expanding the economy, which would then in itself create more taxes. The Democrats, though, they don't care about that. They just want to tax. All they say is they want to tax the rich. Well, I've got news for you. 10% of the people in the United States pay 90% of the taxes. Do you really want to disincentivize the people that are creating the jobs, that are creating the opportunity by taxing them when the taxes are already among the highest of any country on earth? It's insanity. It's communism. That's exactly what it is. It's beyond socialism. It is communism. Kamala Harris wants to raise the corporate taxes to 28%. She wants to raise capital gains to 29%. She wants to impose capital gains on unrecognized gains in your stock portfolio. Your stock portfolio, your IRA, is going to depreciate almost immediately when she becomes president and imposes a capital gains tax on gains that you have not yet realized. It is the biggest disincentive I have ever heard of. So why would my liberal friends be dumb enough to want to support somebody like that? Why would they want to be dumb enough to support somebody who similarly lies? She was the border czar for 3.5 years. She never visited the border until the last month. It was a cursory visit. She made an appearance, posed for photo ops, and left. She said she's going to fix the border. Well, Ms. Vice President, where have the fixes been for the last 3.5 years? She said, well, that's Joe Biden. That's Biden's doings. Don't blame me for that. Then she goes on The View and says, well, I was in the room for every major decision, and I was the last person that Biden listened to before he made decisions. So which version are we supposed to believe? That you disavow any responsibility for the border, but you were Biden's closest advisor and you were the last person in the room. I'm sorry, you cannot have it both ways. And are my liberal friends going to fall for it? Can you really fall for it? Trump comes out with a program that says no tax on tips. What happens? Harris comes out 2 weeks later, no tax on tips. Then you read the fine print and there's so many qualifications that she hadn't done a damn thing except lie to you, which seems to be one of her core competencies. Well, why should I be so mean to say these things? Well, for one thing, she was Indian in 2020 and now in 2024, she's black. And I don't know if you know who Candace Owens is. You can find her on YouTube, and she's done a deep dive into Kamala Harris's ancestry. In Kamala Harris's book, she has a picture of her with her grandmother. The problem is the person that she identified as her grandmother died 4 years before Kamala Harris was born. And therefore, it is either the ghost of Kamala Harris's grandmother or another lie. Candace Owens believes that it was actually Kamala Harris's family's domestic help that she's posing in the picture with. So this stuff just gets worse by the minute. And now the poor people in Asheville and Henderson and Chimney Rock, North Carolina, and the surrounding areas, I'm hearing that they are dramatically underestimating or underreporting the numbers of deaths. I am told that they don't have enough body bags for the number of dead people that are there. And the aid was very slow in coming. I read an article a week ago by Mayorkas who said that there was insufficient money to provide aid to people in North Carolina that were victims of Hurricane Helene. I call it Helen because that's my wife's name. I'm sure it was named after her. That's a joke. That's a joke. Don't turn off your radio. Just kidding. I love my wife. She's going to be on the show in a little bit. You want to stay tuned for that one. But Mayorkas said it, and now Biden's walking it back and said, that's just not true. That's just not true. So the fact of the matter is we're lied to so much. And I have to say, I think both sides do it. Trump has said that the Biden administration was only going to give people $750 in relief. And Biden says that's not true. The emergency relief, the immediate relief is $750, and there will be more to come. So again, you don't know. I don't know who to believe on what. But I know that that Trump had the border slowed to a trickle. I know that he had a wall being built. I know we had 2% interest rates, 1.9% inflation, as we said, full employment. I know that he got us out of Iraq. I know that he got us out of Afghanistan. I know that we had peace abroad. I know that crime went down in America. Isn't that enough? Isn't that enough for you and me and everyone else to have confidence in Trump? Oh, you don't like the man. Oh, I get it. Don't let him in then. Let's have more crime. Let's have more war. Let's have more inflation. Let's have more unemployment. Let's have more lies. Let's have more bad economy because your feelings are hurt. I'm not going to defend Donald Trump and some of his personality traits. I get it. But I'm willing to take the bad with the good. You do not have to like him to be able to vote for him and achieve the results that we need so desperately. This country is in a world of hurt. I truly don't believe that the Ukraine war would have happened if Trump had been president. I'm certain that we would not have had 9% inflation and 4.3% unemployment and all the other things that we've talked about today. This is The Truth. I'm John Gordon. Thank you for tuning in this Saturday as you do every Saturday. We certainly appreciate your coming here. You can also hear us live streamed on YouTube, Rumble, and Getter. We sure would appreciate it if you just go to one of those channels, if not all of them, and subscribe. It's now my pleasure to welcome back Marley Hornik to The Truth. She is an elections integrity expert and runs United Sovereign America. Marley, welcome.
Thanks, John. It's good to be back with you.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You've got your hands full, don't you?
Yes, we took off a big chunk. We really at United Sovereign Americans, we have tens of thousands of volunteers engaged all over the country in research, advocacy, education, and litigation efforts. It's a beautiful machine of American love and patriotism.
So you started United Sovereign America with Harry Hawry, who we had on our show a couple of months ago. We had both of you actually here in the studio, which was our pleasure. And you did this as an outgrowth of the 2020 elections, which you have been working on now for 4 years, as I understand it. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is your purpose is not to relitigate 2020, just to make sure it never happens again.
Yes, we have been experiencing so many issues with our elections that continually get labeled glitches and they continually get labeled clerical errors. But in reality, the way that the Constitution defines our right to vote, we simply don't have room for potential breaches of security and potential lapses in integrity within our voting systems. And when those happen, no one has to trust the outcome. So fundamentally, United Sovereign Americans is seeking a legally valid 2024 general election. And we've spent several years designing a litigation strategy that ends with either total compliance or total accountability on the part of those state administrators responsible for helping congressional members reliably, meaning lawfully elected.
Well, you learned a lot from 2020 and the kind of built-in gotchas that were out there. So tell us how you're going to avoid the problems with the courts again in this go round that plagued us in the aftermath of 2020.
Often I find myself not able to describe our process end to end, but it starts very simply. Our teams of volunteer analysts who are experts in their field, credentialed experts in the fields of software development, data analytics, big data auditing, they run investigations of the statewide voter registration list in each state and the voter participation histories. That may sound pretty dull and all, but these two documents, sometimes they're combined into a single document and sometimes they're split, are actually federally recognized documents that constitute the official list of voters and the official list of participants according to all constitutional federal and state laws that exists in all of the world. It's the only one. So when this list is required by Congress to be accurate and current, when it's not, first of all, that doesn't represent an administrative failure. That represents a constitutional abridgment to the right to vote because Congress said it's necessary for these documents to be accurate. When we investigate these documents, we ask four basic, simple questions. Were the lists accurate? Were the votes counted from eligible citizen voters according to all state and federal law? Was the number of votes counted equal to the number of voters who voted? And did the states meet Congress's accuracy requirement for federal elections to be considered reliable? Inevitably, we discover in every state that we have audited, which is 21 states so far, representing over 338 electoral college votes, we discover that the states have miserably failed to uphold any of those principles of civil rights, protecting our choosing of representatives. So we report all of that to the state officials and to the federal officials who are required under law to investigate these issues as a matter of civil rights. When they fail to follow through on these investigations, our next step has been, and we've done this in 9 states already, to file federal lawsuits against these officials, both at the state and the federal level, who have clearly stood down on their duty to the American people to provide constitutionally reliable elections of representatives. When they fail to respond to these mandamus actions, and this is really the tricky part, a lot of people say, hey, Marley, these lawsuits that you filed in Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, Texas, Michigan, North Carolina, Colorado, and Georgia, they're too late. Well, the point was not to get these adjudicated before the 2024 election, though that would have been nice had we been able to file them back in January. But we filed them in May, or rather, we started in March and then in June and then in August. So the reality is what we have actually accomplished, which is massive. And you have to understand this is being done by citizens. The parties aren't doing this and they're not helping us. The government is not helping us. There is no one helping the citizens save their own country. So just want to say that's awesome. But what we did was we cracked the standing nut. You see, in the past, in federal courts, when citizens have alleged in advance of a federal election that their right to vote is about to be either denied or abridged in any way, which can include dilution of the vote through invalid votes procured through corruption, those citizens who have filed lawsuits to protect that right in advance of the election and have not been heard by the court has declined to adjudicate the matter or even hear the matter before that injury takes place. The citizens have automatic ironclad standing to file for injunctive relief on the basis of civil rights before those elections get certified. Basically, if the courts even fail the people have a right to demand that those elections are either audited end to end to assure that they comply with federal and state law and the constitutional offer to the citizens, the requirement that the citizens choose their representatives, or the elections themselves have historically been thrown out and the state has to do it again. Because if the election is unreliable as a matter of law, then the citizens cannot take the injury in equity. The state is the one who takes the injury. In the balance of interests, the state's interest in, administrative convenience does not outweigh the citizen's injury in denial of a fundamental civil right.
Well, you've given us a lot to unpack there. I break down the voting process. You may be able to help me refine this, but registration, voting, counting, recording, and certification. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, you basically summarized the 4 categories that we actually measure when we look at a state registration list: voters, votes, counts, and then our fourth is auditability. Because even going back to Patrick Henry, during the ratification debates for the United States Constitution in the state of Virginia on June 5th of 1788, Patrick Henry said, hey, if the administrators of the elections are allowed to hide records, they're going to claim that every record is secret and must be held in abeyance. So this is not a new problem. Election officials who don't want to talk about their process and don't want to let the American people see what they've done.
I think that's an important question right there. I don't think that necessarily government attracts the best and the brightest. I'm sorry. That's just that is my experience in having dealt with people at all levels of government. And so you attract people who are not the most motivated people in the world, and they look for the easy way out. And from my experience, government is never wrong about anything, even when it is blatant and in their face. So, what you find, or what I've found in the Georgia case that I was involved with, is that the registration rolls were abysmal. We had people that were registered at UPS stores and homeless shelters and apartments that were abandoned. Well, we saw in Arizona that the voting process in 2022 was severely flawed. The machines were defective in many, if not most, Republican leaning precincts. And then in Georgia, we also witnessed in 2020 that the recording of the votes were flawed because we saw ladies, there were 5 ladies in the State Farm Arena that took 100 count ballots, which was a stack, and each stack was roughly 100, and they fed them through the same tabulator multiple times. And then we see 3,200 flagrantly duplicate ballots on the Secretary of State's own website. So we've got problems with who is registered, who is voting, how the votes are counted. So I take it that you are trying to impact each of those processes based on what I've heard you say.
That's exactly correct, John, because that's how the federal government defines election fraud. The corruption of the voter list, the votes themselves, the counts, and then the denial of transparency to the American people in reviewing what these states allege are the outcomes of elections. So when the registration list is corrupted, so I'll give you a couple of examples. When United Sovereign Americans audits the list, we find all kinds of problems like the ones you're identifying, but we look for different problems. We're not looking for issues where it looks like the registration record, which was originally valid, has not been properly maintained and updated in a timely fashion by the state. We look for registration records that are facially invalid and illegal on that basis, because only legally registered voters are allowed to be on that list by federal law. So in 20 states, United Sovereign Americans found 29 million registration records that are facially invalid and therefore illegal. These are people who, according to the only record that exists, are registered to vote before their birth. They are registered to vote after having participated sometimes in multiple federal elections. They are backdated in the registration rolls. So you look for them in 2021, and this unique ID and registration record doesn't exist. You look in 2022, it's there. It was supposedly created in 1984, and it has now voted in a federal election that is prior to its creation. These are junk data that indicate our voting systems are being breached somehow. Now, just like you, I have my suspicions about how this may be done, but I don't actually know. And you cannot get a legitimate investigation of these processes because the election officials refuse and the law enforcement agencies refuse. So the United Sovereign Americans litigation strategy is designed to get around all of that. Because out of those 29 million invalid registrations, there were 10 million votes counted in the 2022 midterm. That is a staggering amount of what the United States Department of Justice calls felony federal election fraud. In addition, those states counted 2 million more votes than they have any record of any voter participating, including our dear patriotic friend, Asterisk, who's registered in pretty much every state. So this is not okay. This is not a valid process. In any other industry, these systems would be thrown out. The states have an average 13% error rate in the counting of votes, where Congress has determined they are allowed to have a maximum of 0.0008% error in the counting of votes. This is not legitimate. And that's what our lawsuits aim straight at, just like you're saying. And this is not inside of the National Voter Registration Act, where they say, oh, if the registration record is improper, then you need to start sending them postcards and see if they respond with within 4 years. And if they haven't responded in 4 years, then 4 years later, you can remove them from the list. You can make them inactive. But if they show up to the polls, you can hand them a ballot regardless. But this is not a legitimate
Well,
process.
it's insanity. And the question then becomes why? Are these elections officials? I mean, I can only think of two alternatives. One, it is a unintentional result of not performing their jobs, or it is a deliberate act to subvert the outcome of elections. And I just don't know how you can create a conspiracy to come up with 10 million illegal votes and have everybody in on it. So how does this happen? And then I've got to, well, I'll save the other question. Let's focus on that one for now.
Let me talk about this issue about what could the cause be, and is it deliberate or is it inadvertent? In 1888, the United States Supreme Court ruled in a case called In Re Coy that when an election official fails to follow the law, that is criminal intent. Now, I'm going to just help you understand how that context is created a little bit because it's radical. It's very different than any other kind of fraud, right? It's not like securities fraud or contract fraud where you have to actually prove an intentional malice. Election officials are recognized as being the arbiters of what is fundamentally a peace treaty in the United States of America between political factions. When our elections are not basically pure as the driven snow, then factions have legitimate reason to distrust each other and to distrust in a system that they feel slowly more and more disenfranchised by. Because the idea of America is that everyone has a seat at the table. And by forcing everyone to the table who's interested in participating in the democratic process, we get better outcomes for everybody because everybody has to prove their case. So when the election officials either, even if they're ignorant of the law, when they take this job, they accept the responsibility to know the law and to administer this election process faithfully to the law. So when they don't, the United States Supreme Court and standing law in the US says that's criminal intent because they've now disrupted continuity of governance. They've disrupted trust in our democratic institutions and processes. And they may, in fact, have allowed a private interest to enter our hallowed halls of the United States Congress and operate on an illegitimate basis outside the interests of their constituents, their lawful constituents. So this is not just an arcane decision from 1888 that United Sovereign Americans has found and dragged out. This is cited in the current edition of the United States Department of Justice guidebook, Federal Prosecution of Election Offenses. This is good law because there's no other way to hold this country in balance with the massive, diverse representations of political factions, political ideas, political outcomes, and the trillions and trillions of American taxpayer dollars that hang in the balance.
Well, it's good law, but it's only good law if there are judges willing to enforce it. And from my observations, that is one of the big challenges that we have. Have you found any judges with the courage to actually read and enforce the laws that you're quoting?
Yes, in fact, this has happened many times in the last 150 years of election litigation in the United States. Again, what happened after
I'm
2020
really
was almost,
focused on the last 2 to 4 years.
well, let me help you understand why we're having these obstacles because almost every lawsuit that has challenged an election since 2020 has challenged the election outcome. So that creates a different bar of evidence that has to be overcome. It's a completely different standard of evidence, and it's extraordinarily difficult to do. And there's a good reason. The people of the several states shall choose their representatives, not judges. So when a judge is put in the position of having to adjudicate an election outcome, the judge is going to do everything in his or her power to get rid of that political football because it is a hot potato and it is not their area of expertise or jurisdiction. What has worked dozens and dozens of times in American history is challenging the process of administering the election. And in fact, this was the original challenge in Bush v. Gore. It had nothing to do with election outcome. The lawsuit initially hinged on whether or not these dimpled ballots had been uniformly counted across the state of Florida. And it was discovered they had not. And when the recount was forced of these dimpled ballots, the election outcome changed. So I want to talk about two cases. There's one called US v. Classic from 1941, and there's another one called US v. Anderson from 1973. In both of these cases, based on the principle of a fundamental civil rights deprivation acting under color of law, state election officials who certified falsified tallies went to federal prison on the basis of protecting the right of the citizens of those jurisdictions to have a fairly counted election. And these cases were appealed. Classic was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, and they didn't even blink. They just affirmed the lower court's ruling. No, these people go to federal prison. We don't care. This is what happens. And in the case of Anderson, it was a single polling site involving a handful of ballots where the tally that was certified was falsified on the basis of only one single polling site and only a handful of ballots. And these officials went to federal prison.
I got it. But you're going back to 1941 and 1973. What about in the last 2 to 4 years?
No election challenges have been filed on this basis. No one has argued civil rights. That's how you win.
Actually, in the case of Fulton or Jefferson Satir versus the Fulton Board of Elections, we did actually argue civil rights, or a one-off. We argued a 14th Amendment, lack of due process and equal protection under the law, which is in effect civil rights. And our judge was going with us for 9 months. He was ruling in our favor. Brian Amaro in Henry County, Georgia, Superior Court judge. And then he actually ruled that we had demonstrated a prima facie case. Bob Shealy and Charles Bundren, the lawyers on the case. I was tangentially involved in fundraising and communications. And the judge ordered the absentee ballots unsealed. He was agreeing with us, and then just whipsawed. His whole personality and demeanor changed, and he threw the case out for standing 9 months after it was initiated. We had argued standing in the first 2 weeks. That's my concern. It appears that something very serious is going on. And my other concern, while I'm on a roll, we talked about registration, voting, counting, and then recording. If you get all three of those rights, I am very concerned about the recording of the ballots, because we can see from the Edison data that CISA was responsible for recording, that the tallies changed in the middle of the night. And we saw huge shifts in votes for Trump being decremented and Biden tallies at 2 a.m. being increased. And we're told that there's nothing there, don't look there, there's nothing to see. And if you do, you're some wild conspiratorialist. Now just help me understand, how are we going to do it differently in a month?
I think the world of Charles Bundren. He's really a very dedicated attorney, and I'm not surprised to hear about this case. I didn't know about this case directly. I've never read it, so I'll have to get the link from you or get the documents from you. But I'm sure on the basis of what you've told me already that it was extremely well argued, and it sounds like there was some kind of interference with its adjudication. And that is sadly going on in many courts in this country. And what I will say is not that I have a crystal ball or a magic wand any more than Bundren or anybody else in this country has that. What I will say is that United Sovereign Americans is ready and in position to take this to the mat in federal court all over the country. And everything you just said about the machine systems, for example, can be summarized in a single sentence. They have not been properly certified, and illegally the information that enters the black box of the voting system is known and supposed to be transparent to the American people. But what comes out the other side, so the actual process of counting is totally obscured in an illegal maneuver that allowed, independent software companies basically to hide their counting process as a matter of intellectual property. And that's simply not a constitutional decision. So all of that is incorporated into our legal challenges. And, I understand your concern. I will say with the 9 lawsuits we have already filed and the lawsuits we're currently preparing, because again, what we've done is preposition automatic standing to file for injunctive relief before these elections could possibly be certified. That's some of what we're preparing, and we're also preparing civil rights actions that charge election officials directly with deprivation of civil rights, acting under color of law when they do certify these fraudulent elections or these unreliable elections as a matter of law. And again, not only have election officials been put in federal prison for these offenses in the past, but they have also been sued personally. And that has been upheld by the United States Supreme Court because the right to vote is not in the Bill of Rights. It is within the original Constitution. And so their official immunity is stripped when they take this position. Again, it's not that this is going to be easy. It's just that what other remedy do we have? What other pathway, peaceful pathway to do everything in our power to enforce the law in federal courts across this country than to pursue this strategy that is based on standing precedent and based on clear law about election misconduct?
And my hat's off to you. I commend you with every fiber of gratitude I have in my body for what you are doing. I think it is an uphill battle, but we will never get there if we don't try. And 9 lawsuits and more to come. And you figured out how the game is played. And so you're being proactive and you're eliminating the possibility that the court can say, you're barred by latches and estoppel because you should have told us before when you had the information and didn't do anything. So I totally understand the strategy, and I think you're absolutely dead on the way that you're approaching it. I just hope that the judges in this country will rise to the occasion and consider the Constitution and the rule of law and honor the oath that they took to enforce these laws, because our freedoms and our country are in the balance, and it is a grave responsibility they have. And I will say this as we wrap up, I do think 2024 will be different from 2020 in that in 2020, we were really blindsided and caught by surprise. And they had COVID working to their advantage, so they had all these lock boxes, all these absentee ballots. And this year, you've got Trump out there saying, let's overwhelm the votes so that they can't cheat. I just read this morning where Philadelphia, of all places, is starting to look like there are more young people and non-traditional Republicans that are voting for Trump. Even Philadelphia might be contributing towards a red state in Pennsylvania for this presidential election. So,
Do you know that Queens, New York is one of the most Republican counties in America?
yes.
This is a total gaslight about New York City, Philadelphia, any of these big cities. We're being gaslighted really hard. And that shows up in the state's official records. So, I want to talk about one quick thing, John, before we sign off here. I want everyone to know that there is a very, very important way every American can help make sure these lawsuits get over the finish line. And that is an issue, a challenge that we have, which is we have to have real time evidence that the elections don't meet the standard of reliability as a matter of law, which means we need citizens not ranting on Facebook when you have trouble voting or when you get a ballot sent to your address that, for a person who doesn't live there. Don't rant on Facebook. No attorney general is required to investigate your Facebook post. Go to unite4freedom.com, unite4freedom.com, and fill out our 2024 election complaint form. You are going to send your form to your chief election official and your attorney general for your state, and you're going to send it to the attorney general for the United States of America, and you are going to give United Sovereign Americans a copy. And we are going to give you, there's a 3-minute video on our election complaint page that shows you how easy it is to do this. We have made it absolutely as simple as you can imagine. But if you do not give us those experiences you're having when you go out, like John was saying, hey, the machine suddenly didn't work in Republican districts, or the Republicans were sent to different polling sites, and when they got to those polling sites, the poll workers told them they had to vote provisionally. If these happen to you, report it in an official manner, force the election officials to investigate your problem, or force them to be exposed for not bothering to investigate more mistakes in the counting of ballots than Congress allows by law. And most states, all we have to do is generate, 50 to 75 errors in the counting of ballots statewide. Can you guys give us 1,000 for every state? Can you give us 5,000 per state? Let's do this together. File your official election misconduct report with United Sovereign Americans and file it with the officials who have to investigate.
And again, that's the Attorney General, the elections official, which in many states is the Secretary of State, and the U.S. Attorney General. They all have websites. They all have ways you can communicate with them. So,
No, we're going to give you, when you go to that election complaint form, you're going to have the easiest instructions. We have everything prepared for you. You'll receive it all in an email specific to your state when you fill out the form with your personal experience about what happened to you. Why are you filling out this complaint? It's as easy as pie. It's going to take you minutes, probably about twice as long as your Facebook post, but you will help save your country.
Marley, thank you so much. I would imagine these 9 lawsuits and the others that are contemplated, and the website and the complaint forms that you've streamlined a process to handle, cost a lot of money. Where's your funding coming from, and what can listeners do that want to be a part of what you're doing?
They can help. Everybody can help. If you do have extra money, I know that we're all struggling right now with that, but this is all funded by small donors. And every $10 that gets sent in is extremely appreciated. If you donate $100 through usaforfreedom.com, you'll get a free T-shirt with the eagle logo, beautiful T-shirt. So if you can give $100, we'll be happy to reciprocate with a beautiful shirt. But yeah, we really need your help.
So members of our live stream can see the uniteforfreedom.com on your screen. But the radio audience doesn't have that advantage, and that's where the majority of our viewership, listenership is. So it is Unite, the number 4, Freedom, uniteforfreedom.com. You can donate there. You can register your elections complaints or concerns there, and you can also communicate with Marley Hornik, one of the premier election integrity experts in the country. Together, we can make this happen. Marley, I just flat out want to put you out of business, but I think you're going to have some job security for some time to come. But hopefully this dark period in the American history where elections are shaped and manipulated will come to an end. And when that happens, you can look back with pride for having been a force in making that occur. Thank you for everything that you're doing, and keep fighting.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Today we have a very special guest, Ken Khachigian. He has seen behind the curtain in 2 of America's most prominent presidents. Ken lives on the West Coast. He has just authored a book entitled Behind Closed Doors. His career spans decades in politics, communications, and public affairs. Ken brings a wealth of experience and knowledge to his writings. His latest work offers a compelling exploration of the hidden dynamics that shape decision-making in both personal and professional realms through captivating narratives and keen observations. Ken, welcome to The Truth.
Thank you, John. How are you?
Good. And it is such an honor to have you on our show today. And You are the person I have been wanting to talk to literally for decades. I think you might be able to answer some of my questions that I've carried with me throughout my life about these two fascinating men. So let's start with Richard Nixon, one of the greatest presidents of the United States, in my opinion. From age of 7, I was captivated by Richard Nixon. I put my first bumper sticker on for him in 1959. I was just a little boy, but all my parents and relatives were firm supporters of Richard Nixon. So, how many years did you serve in the Nixon White House?
I served there from 1970 to January of 70 to until he resigned in August of 74. So 4.5 years, and that's when he resigned. And for about 10 days after his resignation, I joined him in San Clemente for a brief amount of time to help out after they were still trying to destroy the man. They were attempting to disbar him in New York and California, and of course they weren't satisfied with his resignation. They were trying to go after him for back taxes, and he had no income. He had no job, of course, and sending subpoenas after him, and the prosecutors wanted to still prosecute him. And so I was trying to help him out, get his life squared away after he resigned.
Well, good for you. You've got stars in your crown and a special place reserved for you after this life. I feel pretty certain. I've never seen or known anyone more mistreated than Richard Nixon, unless it was Donald Trump, and we'll get to that. But so, how did you come to work in the Nixon White House?
Well, it's an interesting story. I was a Columbia Law student in New York, 23 years old, and I always loved politics, interested in politics. From my days in California. Saw he was going to run for president. This was late 1967. And people weren't clamoring to support him back in those days. Back then, and George Romney, Nelson Rockefeller, and even Ronald Reagan were the principal star candidates that everybody thought were going to be leading the way to run for president. And so I thought maybe it was a good chance to get on the bandwagon for Nixon. So I sent a letter to his law office in New York City and saying, I'd like to volunteer for your campaign. I got a letter back from Pat Buchanan, got an interview with Pat Buchanan. And Pat had me in and volunteered for his office in New York City. And that led to a job in the campaign that summer. And I worked for Alan Greenspan, who was head of the domestic policy staff. And after he won, I had to go back in California and take my bar exam. But once I got all that done, I got my first job at the White House. So that's how it all happened. Anyway, so I always tell young people, if you're interested in politics, be persistent and you'll get your opportunity. But I took a low-level job answering correspondence, doing anything they wanted me to do in the office there.
And how about Pat Buchanan? Where did he fit?
He's a young editorial writer from the St. Louis Globe-Democrat back in 1964, and when Nixon decided he was going to start making the rounds in the 66 congressional campaigning for candidates, he needed a young aide to help him write, and he got the recommendation from the publisher there at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat that there's this young man who has some great writing skills, and Nixon said he interviewed Pat, and so Pat came to New York and started in 1965 as a young aide and traveled with Nixon throughout the 66 campaign and became a real trusted aide to Nixon in 66 and 67. And Nixon liked to have a balance in his staff, so he hired Pat, and then he hired Ray Price. Ray Price was a more moderate Republican. Ray actually was on the more, not liberal, but more moderate side. He actually worked at the New York Herald Tribune and balanced off Pat a little bit on that side of the spectrum. But Pat was a real loyalist and a great writer. He was my mentor throughout my political career. Totally, I always thought Pat was a better writer than I was.
Well, his career certainly took a meteoric rise. He must be one smart, skilled.
Oh, he's extraordinarily bright. He went to Georgetown, and then he went to Columbia Journalism School, and he's such a great writer. He's so fast and creative, and he edited my work when I was in the White House, and taught me so much about writing, and I owe so much of my career to him.
All right, so you entered the White House at a young age. You became, at some point, deputy special assistant to the president. And so you must have a lot on the ball yourself, Ken. How did you climb the ladder and land in that spot as after having joined on as a 23-year-old Columbia Law School graduate?
I took any job they were willing to throw my way. I started out the communication shop under a fellow named Herb Klein, who was a former head of the, he was the former editor of the San Diego Union out here in California. And then he came to head the communication shop in the White House for Nixon. So I took any job they would throw my way to do writing for the communication shop. Back then, we were defending a lot of the policies that were very controversial in the Nixon years in the war in Vietnam. A lot of his domestic policies were under attack all the time. So we had a large communication shop that had to put out a lot of fact sheets, a lot of day-to-day communications. And so I had a lot of writing assignments thrown my way on a constant basis. And that was my first job. And then with the upcoming political campaign in '72, I was moved over to work with Pat Buchanan to help prepare for the '72 campaign by starting to prepare by tracking the Democratic candidates. You know, the White House is exempt from the Hatch Act, so you can do political work out of the White House. So I started doing work preparing for the campaign and preparing to look at what the political opposition would look like on the Democratic side. And I would be working to, as the campaign approached in 1972, do a lot of writing ahead of time along with Pat and others on the speechwriting staff to help the president prepare for his campaigning throughout the '72 campaign.
So at what point did you meet then President Nixon?
Well, back then I was pretty low on the totem pole, so we didn't have a lot. I didn't have much contact at all with the president, except in large meetings with the political staff or cabinet, monitoring a cabinet meeting every now and then. So I never had to get to have a one-on-one meeting with him. And I traveled, I got to travel twice on Air Force One. The speechwriter always had to travel with him whenever he went anywhere, but there was no one-on-one contact. There was limited contact, and that was true in the Reagan White House. The lower level staff members rarely got to have one-on-one meetings with the president. So I never got to see the President Nixon one-on-one and have personal contact with him until after he resigned from the presidency. And that's when we became very, very close and bonded when I started helping him work on his memoirs and spent 4 years with him out here in San Clemente. And when he had a very small staff, and then I became an extremely close assistant to him. And then from 1975 and right up until he passed away, he and I were very, very close friends, and I was a very special advisor to him, both in his political matters and on his writing his book, the David Frost interviews, the preparation of his library, his counseling of President Reagan, and all kinds of matters. But in the White House, it was very limited contact for someone at my level.
What a fascinating opportunity that was presented to you and that you got to take advantage of. So what did you think of Richard Nixon? He certainly was a complicated person. My impressions and what I've read is that he was very introverted, but he was extremely smart. He had an encyclopedia of knowledge about world affairs and domestic affairs that he acquired over his decades in public service. What was your take? If we were having a martini together and you were on your second or third, what would you say about him?
He was really an intriguing person to talk to, John. There was no normal conversation with him. When I say no normal conversation, because he would, with Nixon, routinely you'd hear him talk about like Winston Churchill or Dwight Eisenhower or Charles de Gaulle, where the conversation would switch to, or maybe he'd be talking about a meeting he had with Herman Talmadge there in Georgia back in 1957, or tell you about an obscure precinct in Indiana that he campaigned in with Charlie Halleck. or then he'd go into a large foreign policy discussion about about the opening to China, or about the balance between China and the Soviet Union. Or he might switch gears and talk to you about baseball. He was a very interesting man. He was interested in a lot of things that happened in the world, but he was constantly interested in politics. And he was an extraordinary strategist. He had extraordinary knowledge about what happened in politics. He was extraordinary capabilities in terms of understanding communications and the skill that took place at reaching people, and what changed their minds, and what happened in political districts and states, and how campaigns were won, and that's what informed me so much in terms of my abilities to deal with Reagan when I later joined Reagan. So it was just a fascinating period that I spent with Nixon in those years in 1975 to 1979, sitting at his knee. And then, of course, from 1980 there on through the rest of his life, over phone calls and meetings, whether in California or New York or in Washington, whenever we talked, there'd be constant fascinating discussions about what was happening in the world or politics. And he had also great sympathy and empathy for a lot of his former opponents, especially, like, I remember when Hubert Humphrey was dying of cancer, Nixon, even though they were very difficult adversaries throughout the '68 campaign and attacked each other very harshly, Nixon, I was in the room with him when just days before Humphrey died, and Nixon felt great remorse about Humphrey passing away, and they had exchanged letters with each other, and they had these phone calls with each other. These two old warriors had great sympathy with one another, and Nixon said to me directly, he said, Hubert was tough on campaigns, but I'll say one thing about him: he was never mean. He was never a mean man. He says, I just feel so badly for him about what's happening to him.
Well, and I think that kind of typified politics of that era. I mean, there are certainly exceptions, but it seemed like that even though you were adversaries, you were respectful adversaries to your opponent. We've certainly changed the culture in that regard in today's politics. But I want to ask you briefly about the different people in the Nixon administration. First of all, it was one of the craziest times of my lifetime. You had the Vietnam War going on. You had the hippies and the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I remember the famous visit that Nixon paid to the Lincoln Memorial to visit the protesters there in the middle of the night. And it was just a fascinating thing. But I think that, and then he was reelected by one of the largest margins of any second-term president ever. And within 6 months, he was staring down the barrel of impeachment. And I think that, for me, the Watergate hearings gave us a special look behind the curtain into the White House and the people that make it work, like Ehrlichman and Haldeman, John Dean. You obviously knew these people, and what were your impressions?
Well, that was such a contentious era. It was, I tell people that he came into office facing three massive headwinds. The first headwind was the Vietnam War. People forget that there were 540,000 troops in Vietnam when he came into office, left to him by Jack Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. 500 boys were being killed in Vietnam every month, John, and 1,000 casualties in addition every month, and protests going on all over the country. He inherited that. And of course, the first thing he did was not expand the war. He tried to wind it down. And Johnson had taken away one of his biggest tools to fight the war. He had stopped the bombing on October 31st of 1968. So it took away a big tool for Nixon. The second headwind was the fact that Nixon never had a Republican House or Senate during the entire 5.5 years he was in the presidency. He was faced with an adversarial Congress and a very partisan Congress throughout the entire time. The third headwind was adversarial media. Now, you know what that's like. You run for office, so you know what it's like to have a tough media going against you. Back then, there was no social media, there was no cable television. There were only 3 television networks, and three news weeklies, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. News, and then two major newspapers, the Times and the Washington Post, and a few others. But mostly, the major media was virtually mostly anti-Nixon, and especially with the Vietnam War, and mostly against his domestic policies, and of course his Supreme Court appointments. So with all these headwinds going against him, nevertheless, he had to deal with the Soviet Union with a massive ballistic missile system, a lunatic government in China until he opened the doors to China, and instability in the Middle East. If you think about what he inherited and what he was dealing with, it was really an amazing session. And this is what we were dealing with day in and day out in the White House with all the people that you mentioned. Now, I didn't work with Ehrlichman and Haldeman, but I worked with all these other people you mentioned in those days during the White House with John Dean and Chuck Colson and, and Herb Klein and all the other folks which were handling day-to-day, Ron Ziegler doing the day-to-day work in the White House.
Well, when I go back and zoom out to 30,000 feet, and like yourself, not like you, unfortunately, you've had a phenomenal career, but I've been a political junkie and have watched and read my entire life. And I was in college when Watergate was unfolding, and I would come back to my dorm room every afternoon after class, and I would watch the hearings on television. So I followed it intently. And, it seems to me that there was one thing in common that John Kennedy, Richard Nixon, and Donald Trump in particular had in common. And in each case, they de-escalated war. Kennedy was taking people out of Vietnam. I mean, I don't know whether Eisenhower, I guess, kind of got us into Vietnam. Well, he did initially, but it was, so my recollection is that Eisenhower sent advisors. Kennedy sent more advisors, and it was escalating. And then at some point, I think Kennedy had a very dramatic change of heart and intended to remove all of our assets from Vietnam. Now, do I have that wrong?
Well, I think that's what they'd like to let people think, because that's the classic view of putting the rose on Jack Kennedy's career. But when Johnson inherited the war, he inherited all of Kennedy's advisors. He inherited McNamara and George Ball and the entire State Department, that Dean Rusk and all the others who began it. So there was no inclination to change the policy. When Kennedy was assassinated, pretty much they decided, well, we'll lay this all on Lyndon Johnson and take it away from Jack Kennedy. But Kennedy escalated up to 18,000 troops, and Kennedy was very fond of the whole Green Beret thing, and his inaugural addresses, we'll pay any price and go anywhere to preserve freedom anywhere in the world. So it was a very militaristic inaugural address that he proclaimed in 1961. So I don't think we should lift the veil of innocence off Jack Kennedy on the Vietnam War at all.
Well, I'm glad you explained that, and you were there, or afterwards, and you certainly had insight. But let me ask you, you mentioned the assassination. It's hard to talk about Jack Kennedy without talking about the assassination. We know that he was killed. We know that he was killed in Dallas. And who do you think killed him?
Well, I don't doubt that Lee Harvey Oswald killed him. I don't try to replay that. They can, if they find something different, if somebody comes up with some other theory that's provable. But as far as I know right now, it's Lee Harvey Oswald. It's too bad that he was shot by Jack Ruby, and we didn't get to have a trial and more investigation and look into it more deeply. But as far as I'm concerned right now, that's a closed history book in my mind, and I don't relive that.
Well, I'm really stunned. Did you know Roger Stone in the Nixon White House?
Oh, yeah, I know Roger Stone really well. I'm gonna be on his show this afternoon.
Well, tell him we talked. Richard Nixon, do you know who was mad at Nixon, and why did they decide to drum him out of office, do you think?
Well, they had a target on his back ever since the Hiss case back in the 40s. I mean, Hiss was a communist and in the State Department, he was a darling of the left, a darling of the left wing. When Nixon went after him to expose him as for perjuring himself, and then eventually when they just proved that he was a traitor to his country, all of the striped pants folks in the State Department who had defended him had a hard time dealing with the fact that this Yahoo lawyer out of California, out of Whittier, California, could expose him. It troubled them because he wasn't one of theirs. He wasn't one of the State Department fancy pants fellows and one of the elite Eastern establishment. He didn't go to Harvard or Yale. And so he went to Whittier College and Duke Law School. And he was an aggressive campaigner against Democrats. So from the very time he got into office in 46 and reelected in 48 and ran that tough campaign in 50, they just never liked Dick Nixon. And because he gave them as good as he got. And he wasn't part of that establishment, John. They just...
Right. Well, and he was very vocal about the Northeasterners and the establishment that never really accepted him. So you follow Tucker Carlson at all? Do you watch him?
No, I have. I've been so busy, frankly, here in the last 2 weeks trying to sell my book, and I spent the last 5 years writing it. So, but I do. I'm fond of Tucker, and I've known him since I knew his dad out here in California. I've probably known him longer than most people.
So he has talked a lot about Kennedy's assassination. He reports having a source who has seen the documents that are still under seal in the United States archives. And his source says that she actually has read the documents, she's seen the files, and that it points clearly that to the fact that, or to the evidence leads you to believe that the CIA was actively involved in the Kennedy assassination. So Tucker also relates a conversation between Richard Nixon and Richard Helms, the then head of the CIA, in the Oval Office, and right after Nixon was reelected to the second term. And evidently they got into a very contentious, heated conversation. And in the midst of the conversation, President Nixon looked at him and said, "Well, I think I know who killed Jack." Richard Helms's response was telling. He did not change expressions. His eyes iced over, and he did not have any response at all. 6 months later, Nixon was on his way out. So I'm leading to a point and a belief that I have developed over a long period of time and a lot of study. And I look at the similarities now with Donald J. Trump. He got us out of Iraq. He was withdrawing us from Afghanistan. Like Kennedy, I think Trump enjoys a relationship with Putin, much like Richard Nixon had with Khrushchev. They weren't friends, but I think they both believed in the adage that keep your friends close and your enemies closer. And Kennedy and Khrushchev were having active dialogue on de-escalating their nuclear buildups. And similarly, Trump, I think, I just read today that Bob Woodward, a name that won't go away, has reported that Trump has had as many as 4 private conversations with Putin. Well, I would suspect that Trump has had conversations with most prominent leaders of the world, both adversarial and friends. So I don't find anything sinister or particularly earth-shattering about that. But the point is, it is my belief, based on the books that I told you that I'd read and a bunch of others, having visited the Dallas and the Grassy Knoll and the School Book Depository multiple times and traced all the footsteps from that fateful day, I have come to the absolute conclusion that Allen Dulles orchestrated the assassination of Kennedy, that Johnson and Hoover and the others either participated in planning it, but at a minimum covered it up. And I'm of the suspicion now that it is the deep state that politically has tried to assassinate the 45th President of the United States on multiple occasions. And I don't have direct evidence that they attempted to assassinate him in Butler, Pennsylvania, and in West Palm Beach, Florida. But I do, based on the evidence that I've looked at the minimum, conclude that the people that were responsible for protecting him did not adequately protect him to the point where they basically opened the door and said, "Come on in." So you have to ask yourself, what did Kennedy, Nixon, Trump have in common? And I would answer that they each were adversarial to the military-industrial complex. Neither of them wanted or encouraged war, and they tried to get us out of conflicts. Dulles and Kennedy were fiercely hated each other, each blaming the other for the Bay of Pigs. And Kennedy, as you know, removed Dulles as head of the CIA. But Dulles never stopped being director of the CIA. He just moved his office to Georgetown, and that's something that you and Roger Stone may want to talk about this afternoon. And he carried on as director, but without the title. So I'm just wondering, who do you think really runs this country? I mean, you would think that the three branches of government do, but I'm beginning to think that there are other elements in the government that are calling the shots.
I'll give you a good example that I'm dealing with. I've tried to get my book reviewed by the Washington Post, and they won't do it. So that's just one. That's one little fraction of the power that the Eastern establishment has.
Well, on that point, can I just interject for a second, Ken? I always wondered, how could the federal government captivate the media? How could that, Bernstein or Woodward was a naval intelligence officer with no journalistic background. And the next thing you know, he's on the Metro desk at the Washington Post and is assigned the biggest story of our lifetime, that being Watergate. And so after Elon Musk bought Twitter, we learned that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, actually paid Twitter, as Mike Taibbi discovered, $3.4 million in exchange for them censoring and canceling people who wrote anything negative about the government narrative on COVID and the vaccine. Now, I'm beginning to sound to myself like some kind of mad conspiratorialist. But how much evidence do we have to have before we conclude that something very wrong is occurring in our federal government? And then one of the members of the Cox family, is sort of a little bit off his rocker perhaps, but he was excommunicated from the family and they paid him $400 million for his minority interest in the company. And so he sat for a Vanity Fair interview, which was 30 pages long. I read it. And in that interview, he said that Cox Enterprises, a media and automobile company, have contracts with the Department of Defense. Really? Now, what kind of contracts would a media company have with the Department of Defense? Just leading me to my suspicion that they're all paid off, that they're all part of the game, and that somebody's got control. And my belief is, with evidence, that it is the CIA. I've read that they have their people planted, embedded in every department of the federal government and in most major media companies in America. And I am worried beyond words about the way that they are destroying this country. Now, I say that, and I feel such a huge surge of guilt when I say it, because I know that there are legions of people in the CIA who are patriots, who uphold the oath of office that they took. So I'm not painting a broad brush, but even going back to the Church Commission, we know that there are major abuses within the Intelligence Committee. We got the information and did absolutely nothing with it. Can you help rehabilitate me and give me some hope? How are we going to solve this problem? Or am I just off my rocker? Have I read too many books?
Well, there's no question we need to clean out a lot of the federal agencies. The federal government has grown so much over the last year. It's just as Reagan said, it's the only thing that never stops growing. The extended life on Earth is the federal government. If Trump gets elected, I think he's going to appoint Musk to go in and and clean that do a root canal job on the federal government, which is very, very important.
Well, and Bobby Kennedy too. And I said a year ago on this program that what a great team Trump and Bobby Kennedy would make if they could figure out a way to park their egos and come together to work for the good of the country.
Very, very difficult. Reagan tried it. We tried it. I mean, I do write about in the book in the first chapters right after the inauguration, in our first cabinet meetings. That was days after he was inaugurated. We had cabinet meetings where he tried to tell his cabinet officers that they had to clean out the bureaucracy, and he was promoting them to fire people and reduce their agencies and to get out waste and to control their budgets and everything else. And as hard as he tried, and he was so excited about getting it done, he was thwarted by a lot of it by his own staff, who told him, you can't do this, you can't do that. And then, of course, and a lot of it was not just the federal bureaucracy, which is entrenched. It was the Congress itself. And the problem with Congress is those fellows and women go in there and they get elected year after year after year after year after year, and they want to stay in office. So they perpetuate themselves, and then they perpetuate the government that is around them that they can give money to, that helps them send money back to their constituents to keep them in office. It's just terrible.
So it's just an unholy alliance where this federal government just becomes a monster, really, that you can't control. And again, I know there are millions of people that work for the federal government, hundreds of thousands that are good people, that are dedicated and motivated for the right reasons. And it works pretty darn good where it works. They keep us safe. Air travel today is the safest place on earth, and the food that we eat and the water we drink, and our national defense is phenomenal. But there is a cancer in our federal government that has to be eradicated. Harry Truman started the CIA. He got it created. He went to Kennedy and said, "You've got to rein it in." Eisenhower said it had gotten out of control. Kennedy said that I'm going to split the CIA into 1 million pieces and spread the parts from the Pacific to Atlantic. 6 months later, he was dead. And you're saying that, I don't know specifically that Reagan was targeting the CIA so much, but Donald Trump was about to release the Kennedy files, and Mike Pompeo, like you were saying that Reagan's people did, talked him out of it. So that's where I think that Donald Trump should become a threat. I think Trump should be a threat to the bureaucracy. And that's what needs to happen in order to get our government under control. But let's talk about Reagan. You served him well, and you became actually closer to Reagan during his presidency, at least, than you were when you were in the Nixon White House, right?
Right, yes. I became very, very close to Nixon after he was resigned. But then with Reagan, we bonded very closely, largely because I traveled with him in his 1980 campaign as his chief speechwriter. And then you become very close to a candidate when there's only very few of you working together in a campaign, and you're working day and night, trying to get elected. And, I came up with his line there, are you better off than you were 4 years ago?
You authored that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you should get royalties. And Trump should pay you because he just used your line in the debate with Harris a month ago.
I'll send him a note. I'll get legal counsel to send him a note.
I think you should.
Well, plus on Make America Great Again, Reagan deserves royalties on that. That was his line. Anyway.
That was taken straight from Ronald Reagan?
Oh, yeah, from his 80 convention speech. Yeah, that's not Trump's line, it's Reagan's line.
I'll be darned, I did not know that.
He first used it in his 80 convention speech. Then I put it back in his 84 convention and speech and his 88 convention speech. So Reagan used it 3 times in his convention speeches.
That's really good to know. All right, so who came up with the idea of telling Jimmy Carter, "There you go again"?
Well, that was Ronald Reagan. That's right. That was just as spontaneous right off the top of his head.
So tell us about Reagan. Could he get elected president today?
Sure. Oh, yeah, in an instant. Yeah. If we got on this campaign trail, we could bury Kamala Harris easily. I'd love to be on a campaign with Reagan. Nixon could bury Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris.
Well, I think that Nixon had the persona of being a real fighter. Reagan just seemed to be everybody's best friend and somebody that you'd really like to be friends with. But I saw moments where he was tough, but was he tough behind closed doors?
Well, he could throw a punch when he needed to. And this is the whole notion about Reagan was, he was very genial and friendly and could tell a joke and lighthearted. But then back in '84, when Mondale was saying mean things about him in October in the campaign and was actually saying vicious things about him that was very untrue and very mean, and Reagan got under Reagan's skin, and he said to me, he says, "Look, we got a counterpunch," and Mrs. Reagan got very upset about it too, by the way, and said, "We're not going to take, yeah, we're not going to take this anymore." And so Reagan said, "Let's go after." Basically, we're going to go after Mondale, and that's when he assigned me to write a very tough speech. And there's some dates I remember very well. And it was October 12th, and we did a whistle stop campaign through southern Ohio, and where Reagan was pounding Mondale pretty good. So when he had to, Reagan could throw a punch.
But, I had a lunch with Donald Regan many years ago, and I had just a great conversation with him. He was a very affable and enjoyable person to sit and have lunch with, even though there's no doubt in my mind that he was one tough cookie. But he said to me, we were talking, I don't know how it came up. He said, well, Reagan never once gave him an instruction or an order as Secretary of the Treasury. And Reagan was with Reagan in the Oval one day and said, Mr. President, I've served you for 5 years. And he said, I was Secretary of the Treasury. Never once did you pick up the phone and call me and tell me what to do. And he said Reagan's response was, well, Don, I just figured you knew how to run the Treasury better than I did. That sounds like Reagan to me from what I have read and studied.
In the case of Don Regan, Reagan agreed with him on supply side economics, and he agreed with him on the tax cuts. If you look at Reagan's diary, and of course that's reflected in my book, Don Regan, when he was at Treasury, agreed with Reagan on all his economic policy. And the disagreements came from the White House itself, from Jim Baker and Stockman and Dick Darman and David Gergen, and not from Don Regan. Don Regan was in Reagan's camp on economic. All the supply-siders were over at Treasury. Norm Torre and the others, Don Regan's staff, were all the supply-siders and tax cutters. And the problem was at the White House. So Reagan, unfortunately, didn't realize that the problems were right around the Oval Office, not over at Treasury. So that's why Regan never heard from Reagan, was that Reagan had all the right ideas about economic policy during the Reagan administration.
So what would the counter have been by Baker and Stockman and others? What
they believed from the outset, and again, I write about this in my book. I document it very carefully. Which is why I want people to read my book, is that from the outset, Baker believed that the budget deficit was the much more critical problem than anything else, and that in order to get at the deficit, if you had to sacrifice tax cuts to do it, you needed to sacrifice the tax cuts. And he told me that right away. Baker told me that when I was working on the inaugural address. And he said, we have to sacrifice the Kemp-Roth tax cuts, we would need to do that. Well, that's not what Reagan believed. Reagan believed in the supply side thinking at the time, which is that if you cut taxes and generate enough prosperity, you're going to create enough wealth that you're going to create a lot of revenue, and the revenue is going to offset the budget deficit. So what you had was people having counter thinking right there within the White House. You had the president had disagreements with his own staff, and And he told me that himself when I met with him in Camp David in June of 81, when he indicated to me his concerns that quote, the fellas didn't want to reflect his crusade in the same manner as he did.
Well, would one of the fellas have been George Bush?
No?
Well, because he certainly made he certainly ended up doing what the people you were talking about said to do. He said, "No new taxes, read my lips." And then in his first term, he raised taxes, doing exactly what he promised not to do. I guess those people got to him. And how did that work out?
Well, that didn't work out well for Bush, but Bush
For the
was
country.
loyal to Reagan throughout his presidency, and Bush didn't try to influence him in any negative way, but it was Bush's people from his campaign, but not Bush himself.
Yes.
Bush, I give George Bush credit. He was loyal. He was a loyal vice president down the line.
So it seemed to me that Alexander Haig kind of got a short end of the straw in the Reagan administration. Would you agree with that? He had one slip of the tongue.
To some extent, he did, but he shot himself in the foot, and he sort of stormed in there. You know, Al's a strong personality, having served as chief of staff, having been a four-star general, having been Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, having held such high positions as he did. Now he came in as Secretary of State. I think he had a little bit of disdain for those in the White House. He didn't like being told what to do. And frankly, he thought he thought probably he could be president, and so it was sort of a two-way deal. And I think it was probably his strong personality got him in trouble a little bit. But on the other hand, they treated him with disdain, which they should not have. I think they should have had more respect for Al and his capabilities and his background and his knowledge and all the intelligence and intellectual capacity he brought to the office of Secretary of State. But they did not. And then, unfortunately, on the day of the assassination attempt, where I was with him when he ran up the stairs of the West Wing up to the press briefing room, and then he misspoke to the American public and said, you know, I'm in control here, in a way that sounded sort of irrational.
Well, in his defense, he said that he was not trying to give the impression that he was somehow sitting in the seat of the President of the United States, but that the Vice President, I believe, was on an airplane on his way back to Washington. President Reagan was at Bethesda. These were in the minutes right after the attempted assassination. And Alexander Haig said that he was just trying to reassure the American people and the other foreign leaders that there was stability in the White House. It seemed like an innocent enough mistake to me that it shouldn't have cost him his career. But I think the real problem was that he wasn't real chummy with Nancy Reagan, as I recall.
No, and he was being undercut to a great extent by those in the White House who didn't like his style, who didn't want Al challenging them, and so it was a clash of personalities, which happens with people in power, John.
Well, and I don't
I
think
wrote a whole chapter on that in my book about the power players in the White House.
well, I can't wait to read it. I don't think it's really limited to the White House. I mean, I've worked in corporate America. I've been in large corporations, and I remember my personal trainer told me that he lost a competition. I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Oh, John, I just don't know how to kiss ass. It was politics." So politics seems to inflict every aspect of our lives in one way or another. But in the moments remaining, you've been so patient, and I really have thoroughly enjoyed our conversation, Ken, and you've been so generous with your time. But I do want to ask you before we leave, roll it forward. Here we are in 2024. We've got less than 30 days before the election. Do you want to make book and tell us what your snapshot of, assessment is of this year's presidential race?
Going forward, I think Kamala Harris's campaign is just going to unwrap. I think it's going to fall apart. I woke up this morning and I was glued a little bit for five or 10 minutes to her Howard Stern interview on YouTube, and it was so monumentally stupid with the back and forth, how juvenile it was.
I watched it. I share your assessment.
I couldn't watch the whole thing. An hour of it would have been such a waste of time, but I watched enough of it, of her talking about them back and forth about how she loved Prince as her favorite artist, and that she and her husband, when Prince died, they danced and sang all night. And oh my gosh, that was just it was
Well, it's just crazy.
she was an unbelievable. It was so juvenile, and I think she's just going to fall apart like she did in the primaries in the campaign between now and November. Then I think this could be a 6 to 7, 8% margin race, and not be a massive landslide, but be a comfortable electoral victory, and be a good margin for him to take into office, because I think her support collapses at the end.
So are we better off today than we were 4 years ago?
Biden, the message is that he has made us a culturally divided country. The Biden administration has destroyed the economy and have moved it so far towards government control on so many areas. So it's the people on the East Coast live in, I don't, no offense to you, John, but when I say East Coast, I mean what it's called, we used to refer to as Boss Wash, that corridor from Boston down to Washington. It's so enamored of itself that they don't think outside of where they are. And so I refer to the political newsletters that I read, and political analysts who think in terms of the pollsters, and they're not getting the big picture. And the big picture is that the people aren't buying into the billionaires and greed and all that stuff. That's not picking up on people. People don't live next to billionaires. People are living real lives.
Well, when I answer that question, I ask by what measure, and I would say in the most major issues in most people's mind are the economy, foreign policy, and public safety today. That means basically the border, I think, on the third tentacle. There's no rational person alive today who has any knowledge of the current conditions in the United States that could give the Biden administration good mark. It's a failing grade on every single one of those. Yet Kamala Harris repeatedly says, I was in the room for every major decision and agreed with President Biden. If you want 4 more years of this, then go vote for her. But she says she was Indian in 2020. She's today black. And I don't know if you've seen the information that Candace Owens is presenting, but there is significant evidence that her whole life story is basically one big lie. She has a picture of her with supposedly her black grandmother, and the lady she identifies as her black grandmother died 4 years before Candace Owens came onto the earth. So it's really hard to see her in a picture with her grandmother when Kamala Harris was in her teens. So just the whole approach seems to be one lie after another. The Tim Walz, 30 visits to China. And he said he fought in Iraq. That's called stolen valor because he didn't. And then he said that he was in Tiananmen Square when the citizens' revolt took place. My God, what is the matter with these people? And could you ever imagine under any circumstances ever allowing them to be in charge of the nuclear codes? I can't. It's a scary, scary time.
No, it's going to come down to that, and that's why it's going to unravel. Her campaign's going to unravel. But again, I think the former president needs to be disciplined and not feel so self-confident that he can say or do anything, because the people will want to feel confident that when he takes charge that he's committed to a stable government when he takes charge.
Ken, where can we find you if someone wants to get to know you better? And
go to my website. Everything's on my website, www.reaganandnixon.com. It's easy to find, www.reaganandnixon.com. You can communicate with me. You can find my book. You can find links to a lot of my other interviews. And I hope they'll get my book. It's got all this information in it. It's got all the information about it's a roadmap to Republican victory, about cleaning out the government, about power players, about what happened in the Nixon and Reagan years, and Anyway, I hope you'll go to it. It's ReaganandNixon.com, no ampersand.
I absolutely will. I'm going to order the book. It's entitled Behind Closed Doors, In the Room with Reagan and Nixon. What a lifetime experience that must have been. And I appreciate your coming on and sharing all this wealth of knowledge with our listeners and our viewers today. Ken Khachigian, an historian, a political activist, and a very enjoyable person to talk to. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Well, here we are. It's 6:40, the day after I dropped Helen off. So for 24 hours, I haven't been with my wife, which is one of the longest times we've been apart in a while. I just kept myself busy. I was determined I wasn't going to worry about her. But then at about 8:45 last night, I was out to dinner with some friends and my phone rang and I looked down and it was the surgery center. Well, my heart almost stopped. My stomach came up into my mouth and I answered, "Hello, this is John." The female voice on the other end of the line said, "This is the surgery center. I'm just calling you about Helen." I'm like, "Okay, get to the point." She said, "I just wanted to let you know that Helen is resting comfortably. She is doing fine, and you can come and get her at 6:45 tomorrow." Well, it wasn't but 30 minutes later when I got a text from Helen that was almost unintelligible. She said, "I can't see a thing. This is awful." So I said, "Do you want me to come and get you now?" And she did not reply. So here we are. We're at the surgery center. I'm going to go in now and we're going to get Helen. I'm here to retrieve the patient. Yeah.
Come with me.
Am I at the right place?
Yeah, you are.
Okay. I love y'all's facility.
Thanks.
It's really pretty.
This whole side is new. The newest side.
I can tell.
And here's Michelle. She's the nurse that's been taking care of
Okay. Hi, Michelle. How are you? Yes.
you.
Yeah. Oh, my. Oh, dear.
He's got to already take the pictures.
You don't look good.
You don't look good.
How do you feel, Mother?
I feel great. The
Well,
whole
you're going to
body
look
feels good.
She's
wonderful
gonna
in
look
about
phenomenal.
what? Like tomorrow?
No. 4 to 6 weeks. But her
4 to
keel,
6
her
weeks?
keel is going to look beautiful within a week.
Oh,
After
wow.
a week, she's going to look like she has a sunburn. But you see the skin right here? That's what she's going to have. Beautiful baby butt skin. And everybody loves baby butt skin.
I love baby butts.
Yeah, baby butt skin is great. So that's what she's going to have in a week.
You don't look happy.
I'm very happy.
She is very happy. She slept very good. She had yogurt. She had 2 cups of coffee.
Yep.
Do you want to go out to breakfast?
Sure.
You
Tell him
crazy
he can
girl.
stop
You
at the
crazy.
stop, like the drive-through and get your breakfast.
Yeah, we'll go to McDonald's and get a hash brown.
Yeah.
Well, she seems like she feels great.
Yeah, just don't do too much because you've got a lot of energy. So don't do a whole lot. All right. By the way, I love your show.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
You
Keep
watched
it
it.
up. Yes, I do. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, keep it up.
I
Yeah.
think I found the right doctor for you, John.
You really did. I like
great for
everything about this place. Well, you run a good business. I've been in business for 40 years,
Thank
and I know it when I see it.
You look great. You look really, really good.
Okay. I
All
feel
right,
really good.
so rest at home. Don't do a
I'll
whole
try.
lot. Okay.
I'll try.